Hi, everyone. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. I know some of you towards the back might not have seats. There are seats at the front, like a good professor. It's okay to sit at the front. You won't be judged. There's also seats in the middle, so please do find a place to sit. I think we're going to maybe bring in a couple of chairs at the back as well. But seeing as the music has cut out, I guess we could formally start. And yeah, just invite anyone who's looking for a seat to come on down. Spots in the front, spots in the middle. And yeah, we'll be happy to welcome you. Okay, so thank you all for joining us. I have, so today we're here because we're going to hear an amazing talk from a distinguished guest. And I'll just say a few words about the, about the talk, its history. Not today's talk in particular, that will of course come in a few minutes. But I'll give you a sense of what this talk is about generally. So when Professor Morley Gunderson didn't quite retire from the university, he's never really retired, let's just put that out there. He never wanted a Festschrift. Okay, for those of you who don't know, it's a goodbye to a well-known academic, and people like former students come and tell stories, but also maybe present papers. We actually just went to a Festschrift at Cornell University this weekend for Harry Katz, very well-known person in the field of industrial and labor relations. Also, we found out was a labor economist with Hank Farber. They were both at MIT. That's where they started their careers. So interesting. But Morley said, no, I don't want a Festschrift. So we said, we have to do something. Morley was cross-appointed at the Department of Economics and the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources. Morley established the master's program in 1976 and then started the PhD program a decade after, 1986. So we said, how about a lecture that blends insights from labor relations, industrial relations, and labor economics in the spirit of your work? He said, fine. Okay, so that's what we did. And this has now been over a decade, 11 years. I can't believe it. In your program, towards the end, actually in the last page, you can see the list of distinguished scholars, academics that have come and given this talk. Pretty impressive. One of the things that I think is different from this year is that up until now, everyone on the list was someone Morley knew personally or in that generation of scholars. I think with this year's speaker, we've shifted to a different generation, and yet the sort of same elements of rigor, academic rigorousness, but also relevance. The policy element of what the work generates is almost as important as just the intrinsic value of the academic research itself. So important policy implications also come with this talk. And it's a nice chance to also kind of honor the tripartite nature of this event, which includes Department of Economics, the Center for Industrial Relations, Human Resources, and Woodsworth College, which used to host this event in their beautiful speaking lecture facility, but now it's being torn down and they're constructing a whole new facility with double the space that the old venue had, and until such time we'll use venues like this, which are also great on campus. But Woodsworth College, the Center for Industrial Relations, and Department of Economics, I'm very glad to welcome you here today. So the other thing that comes with this, our itinerary for today, is the Morley Gunderson Prize. So because we've been honoring guest speakers to speak in some way relevant to Morley's past work, which blended labor economics, industrial relations, we also now take this opportunity to award the Morley Gunderson Prize, which was founded, I think, on the 25th anniversary of the start of the master's program. And since we've created the Morley Gunderson Lecture, we now give the prize on this date. I'm happy to introduce this year's award winners who are listed there, and I'm going to invite them both to come up. Well, not at the same time. This year's award winners are Eileen Coyle and Robin Ross. We can give them a round of applause. They each have achieved a path of career success. They've also given back to the center, and so that's the dual criteria we have for this award. Someone who's achieved this personal pathway of professional success, but who has also seen the time, given their time, to help new graduates, alumni, find jobs, mentorships, all these sorts of things. So these two candidates this year, these two award winners, embody that. Maybe I'll start with Eileen, since you're right here in front of me, to come up first, maybe say a few words, and then we'll present you and Robin. Well, Robin will say a few words, and then we'll present you with the award.
Thank you. I have to move this down a little bit. Perfect. Thank you so much for today. Thank you to Morley and Raphael and members of the selection committee for this prize. It's truly an honor to be recognized by this community side by side with my good friend Robin. Although I understand that the nominations remain confidential, I do want to thank whoever submitted this on our behalf, and I'm deeply grateful for the acknowledgement. It's been nearly 12 years since I graduated from the MIR HR program, and what has really stayed with me the most from that time is the faculty, the staff, and the other alumni's commitment to seeing everyone succeed both within their doors and outside. I always felt so supported during my time there and knew that I really had a cheering squad in everyone for this community rooting for me once I got there out in the workforce. I've really continued to do my best to ensure that feeling of community and endorsement for the new graduates and the current students today. It's really exciting to see the evolution of the program. I'm hearing so much about its growth since our time there and the continued opportunities that the students have both in the workforce as they enter new graduate programs and more co-op opportunities than I say we had at the time. To share a quick personal story, my parents are at the moment preparing to move out of my childhood home that they've been in for the last 26 years. And with the big move like that, comes a lot of purging. And I'm guilty of using their basement as a time machine for all of my things. So recently I've actually had to go through all of my notebooks, essays, printed articles, and textbooks, both from my undergraduate and the MIR program. It was really fun to flip back through what I was reading, what I submitted in my essays at the time, and what really struck me the most was about how relevant they still were to my working experience today. I'm not actually working in a current formal HR role at the moment, but I would say I spend my days as a people leader creating change management strategies, onboarding documentation for new hires, and I've become the resident expert in hiring within my department. So I do want to say how much the education prepared me for what I'm using today. I'm extremely flattered to be acknowledged today for outstanding professional achievement. Working at an organization like Manulife is to be surrounded by high-performing peers and leaders who always challenge you to do your best. And so my hope for the current students in the room and new graduates here today is that you also find a company that can give you the opportunity to try new things and take a non-linear career path. So thank you again to everyone in the room who make the center what it is today. I'm really proud to be a graduate of this program, and I'm really proud to accept this award as part of this community. Thank you.
Yes, so our next recipient, Robin Ross, will now say a few words. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.
You might need this a bit higher. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you, Raphael, and thank you for this prize. This is a surprising and I'm incredibly honored to receive it, particularly because of Morley's legacy, but also looking at the list of the people who've won this in the past. I'm not sure it's a list that I feel like I belong on, but I'm incredibly grateful to be here accepting it. Thinking about what I wanted to say, reflecting on this prize, I thought that maybe what I could do is offer a little bit of my reflections on why the center was such an amazing place to be during my time at the center, but then also how the center is still impacting me in my life today. It was when I was in the program, I found the kind of student that the center attracts is it's a student who there's some real opportunity costs for them being there. They're making real sacrifices. They're taking a step away from their career. Maybe they're juggling family. These are people who are deeply engaged. They make deeply engaged and have a mind towards advancing their careers, and that makes for a really energizing learning environment. So I think that's one major thing that I took away. I think like the other thing is just how supportive this community is. I run into Carol already today, Vicky. I mean, these are people who made our time at the center incredibly comfortable, you know, and it helped us with everything from you know, the mundane to the existential crisis. Sorry, I'm looking at you, Carol. So the other thing that I was going to talk about was how it's still impacting my life today. So, you know, I think, you know, after leaving the program, drew a lot on the theoretical and the practical learnings that you get here. When I think about why this program is so great, you know, really it's that you get such a you get both the theoretical and the practical. You know, but later on in my career, this is a reflection that I had sort of preparing for today, is that a lot of what I still draw upon today, maybe less so those theoretical and practical learnings, is some of the more values-based learnings. I think the center does a really amazing job of attracting students with good values, teachers, faculty, support staff, bringing in industry leaders who model the right values. And I could really see myself having an HR career, having a labor relations career, seeing some of those values being modeled here at the center. So I think that just one final note about how it's still impacting my life. Aileen mentioned that, you know, we had a fairly close group of friends and remain close today. We still get together over the holidays, and it's had an incredible impact on my life professionally, but also personally. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that I also met my wife here in the program. Sorry that I mentioned that last, but that's yeah, that's what you'll all be left with. So thank you very much for this. This is an incredible honor and a surprise. Thank you.
I knew where Robin was going with that last piece. And also, by the way, you made Morley so happy. You mentioned opportunity costs in the same breath of, so it was a nice duo. Before I introduce Professor Damiano, who's going to introduce today's speaker, I did have one moment to bring to light something that's very dear to my heart and also to the center's, I think, history. Professor Ian Sakanovsky passed away unexpectedly over this holiday period. Ian was a PhD student along with myself. We were both in the same, literally the same room on the third floor in Woodsworth College, where our PhD office was located. He was also a professor at Ryerson and TMU, and he came to all of these events. He came to every Morley Gunderson lecture, he came to every Sefton Williams lecture, He was just a perennial feature of the center, even though he had left and was teaching at Ryerson. So we honor him with a endowed archival project, which the library has been undertaking for a while. The center has a library. And we have a labor history collection. That is sort of the founding documents of most of the unions in Canada are located in our center, and other pieces of important information. And we're asking people if they're interested, if they want to honor both that archival work, but also the legacy of Ian, if they're interested, they can give. So there is a page and a link. It doesn't have to be photographed here. You can find it later. And on top of that, we've also established a fund to fund this lecture. We provide, of course, most of the funding for hosting the event, but if people want to give to enduring, keeping the legacy going, you're also going to be able to donate to the lecture series so that it's on a firm foundation for the future. So those are just a couple of mentions. Now I think we can invite Professor Damiano, who's going to introduce today's speaker. Thank you, Vittore.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Ettore Damiano. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics. As Raphael has already mentioned, the Morley Gunderson lecture was established to honor Morley's contribution in the fields of labor economics and industrial relations. And it's really an event which is sponsored jointly by the Center of Industrial Relations and Human Resources, the Department of Economics, and Woodsworth College. It's really also oops, sorry, what do I do? No. I really don't want to do that. It's enough. It's also an opportunity to really bring together, at least once a year, faculty and students from at the Center of Industrial Relations and Human Resources and the Department of Economics. These are really two separate units, but have long been interconnected because at the end, it's really a deep and complete understanding of how the labor markets work, which is central to economic discipline, demands also an understanding of unions, human relations, and their role in determination of wage and employment. So today, I'm really honored to be given the opportunity to introduce the 2026 Morley Gunderson Lectures speaker, Professor Magne Mogstad. Professor Mogstad is the Gary Becker Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago and one of the leading economists of his generations, widely recognized for his influential contribution to labor economics, public economics, and study of social policy. Professor Mogstad's academic accomplishments are really too many to list completely, but here are a few. He's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, as well as the Norwegian Academy of Science and Letters. He's a fellow of the Econometric Society, the Society of Labor Economics, and the International Association for Applied Econometrics. He has received several important prizes and recognition, including in the field of labor economics, including the 2017 IZA Young Labor Economist Award, the 2020 Sherwin Rosen Prize for Outstanding Contribution in the field of labor economics, the Fridtjof Nansen Award for Young Norwegian Researchers, and so on. He was also the lead editor of the Journal of Political Economy and the foreign editor of the Review of Economic Studies, some of the most influential outlets for economic research. A defining feature of Professor Mogstad's research is his focus on causal inference, developing and applying methods that allow economists to draw credible conclusions about cause and effect relationship. This approach is especially important in the study of public policy, where randomized experiments are often not feasible. By leveraging the natural experiments, administrative data, and innovative statistical techniques, Professor Mogstad has been able to shed light on complex questions such as the long-term effects of early childhood interventions, the impact of welfare programs on labor supply, and the role of family backgrounds in shaping economics mobility, and so on and so on. His work really frequently bridges methodological innovation with substantive policy relevance, ensuring that his findings are both technically robust and practically meaningful to society. So much fitting with the tradition of the Gunderson lecture, understanding the functioning of labor markets is at the core of today's lecture. And so we are really fortunate to have Professor Mogstad talk to us about two very important findings in labor economics on the impact of minimum wages on employment and on the impact of immigration on wages and how they can be reconciled. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming this year's speaker for the Morley Gunderson Lecture in Labor Economics and Industrial Relations, Professor Magne Mogstad. Please.
So thanks for having me. I learned today that I have more connections with Morley than I realized. We have the same interest in labor economics, and I learned a lot from his papers, including some about minimum wages in Canada. We're also kind of Norwegian. As maybe you can tell from my accent, I'm born in Scandinavia, in Norway, and Morley's dad was born there too. Maybe he got rid of the accent. I never did. My 5-year-old keep reminding me about that, but you know, it is what it is. So I'm going to talk about this paper I've been working on for a long time. It started out actually at dinner with Jim Heckman. And Jim Heckman started making fun of David Card. They're both incredibly influential labor economists, somewhat competitive, at least Jim. Saying that, like, how can David Card seriously think that these two things can be true at the same time? How can an increase in minimum wages affect wages but not employment? While immigration, which is kind of like labor supply, new guys coming in, affects total employment but not native wages. And that's become kind of like a standing joke. I mean, how can you think that if you change the wage, then employment isn't affected, but if you change employment, then wages are not affected. You can't have it both ways. So that was a joke that seemed kind of lost at the Nobel Prize, where they said we have this like new set of methods, very credible. They have these two incredibly incredible findings that are important, which was that if you increase minimum wage, that doesn't lead to fewer jobs, and if you get immigration to the country, that doesn't hurt the natives. So, you know, we thought, you know, why is this? It's kind of a puzzle. We're not the first to think of it. We want to like take it seriously and think, is it really a puzzle? If so, how can we resolve it? So the puzzle is, if immigration-induced employment increase or absorb in the economy without wages adjusting much, that means if you change the wage, employment doesn't have to, or if you change employment and wages doesn't have to adjust much, then why would employment respond so little to a change in the minimum wages? Like, I'm told I'm not allowed to use a lot of math, so this is going to be my only math. But you know, think about it, if you want to think about it like that, if I change E, employment, and wages don't change, flip it around, then if you change W, then employment needs to change. Okay? Can't have it both ways. Now we come on the joke. You kind of have to make up your mind. Either you're in favor of immigration or you're in favor of minimum wages. So we're gonna like take this puzzle seriously, maybe too seriously. You can tell me afterwards. And if you want to like do Econ 101 about what this puzzle is, you can think about it like this. This is the labor demand. This is the labor supply. Minimum wages tell me it's what you go from here to here. In competitive market, that's 2 points on the demand curve. I learned about the slope of demand. I set this wage, I increase the wage, the firm is going to hire a few people at a higher wage. Well, what about immigration? Well, labor economists typically think about immigration as a shock to supply, more people come in. So now you get a supply curve, shifting down. 2 points on the demand curve there too. Well, now we're kind of in trouble if you think this is a good representation of the economy, because one of the papers from David Carr, more broader literature, suggests demand is perfectly elastic. The other one suggests it's perfectly inelastic. How can that be the case? Okay, so that's kind of the starting point. So there are kind of two broad explanations. One is that that's not really true. If you do a survey of the whole literature, not those two papers, people don't find that. Or maybe one set of estimates is wrong. I don't believe in the minimum wage papers, because minimum wage increase in a period where demand is increasing or something like that. Another explanation is that the competitive labor market model is wrong. It's so misleading that what's true in the data just requires a different explanation. So we want to kind of sort out those two things. And what we're going to do today, we're going to start presenting a systematic review of the literature. It's going to be focused on the US, because we want to limit attention to the same economy. But I think it's true more broadly. We're going to conclude that the empirical puzzle, that minimum wages don't affect employment, but immigration at the same time don't seem to affect the wages. That's broadly true. It's not only David Carr who finds that. Once you see the literature as a whole, we deal with some issues, those are kind of pretty robust facts. Then we're going to say, maybe the research designs are not that good, but we need so much bias, so many problems in the research design to explain these things, that's probably implausible. Okay? That's where we're going to land on this. I'm going to show you why. And then we're going to say, let's now turn to economics. Maybe the view that, Chicago view maybe, that labor market is approximately competitive, maybe that's pretty bad. That's not enough. We need to be bad in a certain way. So you're going to think about, how can I make that model be able to rationalize those findings? And we're going to start with three things. We're going to think about the perfectly competitive labor market. Maybe firms have market power. Maybe labor supply is very inelastic. Maybe immigrants and natives are close substitutes. And we'll explain what this will do. And maybe immigrants not only bring the labor supply, but also local demand. Okay, so we're going to show these possible explanations, and we're going to try to quantify which of those could help explain these findings. I'm going to show you there are a couple of possibilities. Okay? And then given those possibilities you can choose between, those are going to have very different implications for other things. Okay? We're going to have some provocative ending of this. We're going to say, if you want to be in a camp where you think immigration doesn't affect labor wages, and minimum wages doesn't affect employment, then you're going to have to believe something else too, that more labor taxation is going to be pretty bad for the economy than those losses are big. So in other words, you can be leftist on some things, you can't be on everything. Okay? Internal consistency means that you can't hold all possible opinions at the same time. On the right there's no logic anymore, so let's not pick on that. But we're going to try to use the data and the model to discipline what are the internal consistent explanations that fit the data that you can possibly hold, and what does that tell us about economic policy. You can't cherry pick your facts depending on the policy you look at. That's going to be kind of the broad message of this talk and the paper. You might say, why care? We think it's interesting for two reasons. One is, it's kind of amazing when we go through this literature. Not a single paper on immigration talks about the minimum wage literature. Not a single paper on minimum wages talks about immigration. But they're all about labor demand. It's just at least to recognize that the other literature exists and that it produces very different estimates. So we kind of want to push it back against this view that every study is done in isolation, and we sort of try to think about what we can cumulatively learn about the function of the labor market by looking at cross studies, those are cross literatures. And then last, it's going to be that by using those restrictions, it's going to put a lot of discipline of the logical possible explanations of things you see in the labor market and the implications of that for public policy. You don't get to pick and choose if you do labor economics and you look at the data. You have to have an internal, consistent set of views. That's going to be like the underlying message of this. So let's start with like what we call a meta-analysis. That's just like a fancy word for looking at many papers trying to summarize what the key insights are. So we're going to do that. We're going to start with, we're going to kind of tie our hands and start with some famous survey papers on minimum wages by Dube and Neumark, and another set of papers on immigration by Dustman and co-authors and Aubrey. We're going to take all those studies and we're going to read through them and collect the estimates, think about the data, and use that to summarize the findings. Okay? I can promise it was pretty painful. Not all these papers are my favorites. But instead of picking favorites, we're going to try to look as a whole, the whole literature, say, do they give us a similar message about the main effects? And do those main effects differ significantly across the literature? There's going to be some variation. Even in Morley's paper, I think you have one minimum wage paper finding positive employment effect for old people and one finding more mixed effect for young people. That's going to be true in those papers, but still we're going to find a very systematic difference between the minimum wage literature on one hand and the immigration literature on the other hand. Okay, so what are we going to do? We're going to collect in each study the employment response and the wage response to immigration changes and to minimum wage changes. I'll show you a couple of examples how we do that. I'm going to show you like what we find. Okay, so I promise to not a lot of math, but I'm going to use a little bit of notation to show you the tables and figures. So what do? We're going to get the employment response compared to the wage response. We call it like employment elasticity with respect to wages. We'll do that for the minimum wages and for immigration. So delta E is going to be the change in employment due to minimum wages, the change in wages due to minimum wages, and this becomes the elasticity of employment with respect to wages that are reduced by the minimum wage. And we can do the same for immigration. So once we collect all those numbers, we can start seeing what the pattern is across studies. Okay, let me sort of show that for one study, and then we can show you the results more broadly. This is a nice paper by someone with a difficult name. It's called Dube and others. It came recently in the Journal of Economics, and let me show you an example of the type of studies we're talking about. They look at minimum wage changes in the US over a long period of time. An idea of that paper is shown kind of by this figure. So what is this figure showing? This figure is showing in the red, this is the earnings distribution, or wage distribution in the US before and after a change in the minimum wage. So red here is how the earnings distribution looked like before the change. Okay? This is like the share of people, or number of people earning this much, and so on and so on. Okay? Then the blue one is showing the same distribution, but after the minimum wage change. Okay, so what's happening? Well, you can't pay below this anymore. There are no jobs like that by construction. And there are two things that can happen. Those guys don't get a job, they leave the labor force, or they get the higher paying jobs above here. Okay, so the blue area here is going to be the new jobs they get. And the difference between the blue and the red is the missing jobs, the people leaving the labor force.
Magne, sorry.
Okay.
This one, just so they can hear online.
Yeah. Okay, like this. Okay. So that's what they do. They compute these things. They look at the new, better paying jobs compared to the lost jobs, and then you can get the unemployment as the difference. So I think it's kind of a clever paper. They do that in the following way. This is the effect on the new jobs, the missing jobs. This minus this, you divide by the percent change in minimum wage, and you get one of our elasticities, the change in employment with respect to the minimum wage. They do the same for wages there, and you can take the ratio of this to this, and you get our IV. Okay, so that's what we did. We went through all these studies, collecting these estimates, constructing the elasticity, how minimum wage and immigration affect wages, employment, and we can take the ratio. This is the minimum wage literature across all the studies. This is what we call a histogram, the number of studies by the effect estimates they have. Okay, so 0 would be that the minimum wage had no impact on employment. Large positive, larger. Okay, here's the same on wages. You might ask, why do we see so many few studies here and so many studies here? Because a lot of studies on minimum wage don't really look at the effect on the wages. They only look at the direct effect on employment. But anyway, so these are like famous studies like Card. Kruger is kind of an outlier out here. And now we collected all this data. Some of those are going to be very noisy, like Card Kruger. So what the meta-analysis does, it says, let me take all these papers, the studies, let me weight them by how precise they are. If it's just noise, they get less weight. If they're very precise, they get more weight. Okay? Then it looks like this. I mean, kind of the same, but just smoothing out the distribution a bit. What does this tell us? It tells us that overall, it seems that minimum wage does little to employment. But it does increase the wages. Not one-to-one, because a lot of workers are not in minimum wage paying jobs. But you know, it does have a pretty significant impact on wages and almost no effect on employment. So meaning the Card paper is a pretty good, you know, example of what people tend to find. So we're going to say, at least when you just look at the data, that seems to be the case. Minimum wages affect wages, but not employment. So we can kind of summarize that. This is the average across all the studies. This tells me on average, then a 10% increase in minimum wage decreases employment by 0.4%. Okay? Which is very similar to, I think, what you find for young people. If we take the average across the groups, it's kind of like a 0 effect. What is this interval? This interval tells us how much variability is it across studies. Well, this is the 90% confidence interval, if you want to think about it like that. This tells us 90% of the papers find something between 0.07 and 0.02. So like, it's pretty good evidence suggesting that most studies don't find much of an employment response. You can say the same for wages. Most studies do find substantial, but not very large wage effects. You take the ratio, and that gives us the elasticity of employment with respect to wages. And, you know, it's modest. This is what the first exercise is. Okay, and then this would mean that labor is very inelastic, labor demand. Okay, so the first kind of fact. So now let's turn to the, this is how the possible labor demand curves look like. This is like the price against quantity. This blue area are all the possible labor demand curves that will be consistent with the data. I mean, some of them have the wrong sign, so you could probably rule those out. But this, if you use the 90% interval, it tells us that 90% of those studies are going to be having a labor demand curve that goes somewhere in here. Okay? So we're going to say that that's a fact. Okay? We're going to make an argument for why it's not biased. That's like the first fact. Now we want to do the same when it comes to immigration studies. Exactly the same exercise. Here's the famous paper by Borjas. Borjas looks at what happened to the wage of workers by skill and age and employment, the natives, when you get more immigrants of that type. Okay, so the idea is like some areas get a bunch of immigrants with a given skill group or a given age group. What happens to the wages of natives and employment of natives with the same skills and the same age? Okay, so he finds that, you know, the earnings per week, kind of like hourly wage, goes down quite a bit, and this is kind of hours worked, also declines quite a bit. So you take that, then you get an IV, which is a ratio of the two. So here I plot out all the studies. This is the Borjas paper. It's quite an outlier. Again, it's going to be very imprecise. It's going to get very little weight. But this is kind of the papers we teach. I think influenced a lot of the thinking. It's quite an outlier when it comes to employment elasticity and wage elasticity. Here's how the distribution look like. Even Borjas paper, but especially the others, find a large employment elasticity. This means that if you drop a lot of immigrants into the labor market, they're more or less fully absorbed. They get jobs. They're not crowding out the natives. They're getting new jobs. Okay? This tells us that the wages of the natives doesn't seem to change much. So that's like the success story, like we hear about. Like you get immigrants in, employment goes up because they all get jobs, and the natives, the wages don't really change. Prices go down a bit, they're all better off. What this means about labor demand, or you could do the adjusting for uncertainty, and it's going to look like this. They're all concentrated around employment elasticity of 1, and with a wage elasticity close to 0. So this also means that the early card papers kind of spot on. Okay, there may be something wrong with all these papers, but at least giving a similar message when it comes to the typical results of immigration and minimum wages. So if you want to look on average, a 10% point increase in foreign share of working population increase employment of about 10%, almost 1 to 1. Native wages, it's basically exactly 0 and almost doesn't vary. Which means that you're going to have a labor demand. I mean, remember we go to school, we can't take this and divide by this. Dividing by 0 doesn't work. But you can still compute the confidence interval, the variability across the estimates, which is what we do here. And this tells us that you're going to have to believe that it's very inelastic. It doesn't belong here, so it needs to be smaller than this or larger than this. Okay, this is the wrong sign, so think about this. It means that it has to be more elastic than 190, which means that you pretty much perfectly elastic labor demand at that point. You're going to absorb any kind of shock. So what does that mean in the graph? It means like this. This is the implied labor demand in the competitive markets. And this is the one from the minimum wages. So, if you belong to like I teach undergraduates to start with the competitive market model, you say, well, that's kind of weird. Like this is supposed to be labor demand. Supply comes in 2 points on the demand curve. This is supposed to be labor demand. And there's just one says it's perfectly elastic, the other one says it's very inelastic. Okay, so we're going to say that's kind of a common finding. It's not specific to Carr's papers. Then you might say, well, hold on. Maybe all these papers are bad, or some are bad, and I have my favorite, and my favorite paper is not the case. Okay? So let's go through that argument a bit more systematic. I gave this at the early version of this at Stanford, and everyone had their favorite paper. And there was no one had the same favorite paper. So we thought, okay, why don't we do this like a little bit systematic? And many of the favorite papers were like by the people in the room. So we thought like, let's now think about this a bit more systematic. One could be publication bias. Maybe like to get published in economics, because we're so lefty, we want to only have those that give you immigration is good and minimum wages are good. Or maybe we just want significant effects, I don't know. So in our paper, we go through different models of why people publish and see if that can explain the distribution of findings. And the answer is like, no, that's not really the case. Okay, the second, which I think was more plausible when we started out, saying, well, maybe these are just like different studies that use different people. There's not one single labor demand curve. Maybe the minimum wage guys are different from the people who are competing with jobs for immigrants. Probably not, but suppose it was, then we're just reflecting different labor demand curves, or different time periods, or maybe using different research designs. So to get at that, we can start looking at across studies. This is the case where you're looking after a recession versus before the recession. You find the same thing. You're looking at the short-run estimates versus long-run estimates, where capital may adjust and people may move around. Similar picture, this is one where you just conditional observables. Here you use an RD or an instrument, doesn't seem to matter that much. Here you look at like low-skilled only, and so on and so forth. So, we're limited about what we can do because we only have 70 studies. But, however you cut the data, that doesn't seem to be explaining stuff. Okay? So as far as we can tell, this finding is kind of robust. It does not mean that the estimates don't depend on vary across people. It's just that the gap between the perfectly elastic and the perfectly inelastic is just too big. It's not going to be explained away by how you cut the data. So then the third possible point is you saying that I don't believe in some of these studies, maybe none of the studies. The reason that the minimum wage effects are positive is because the places introducing those are experience higher demand at that time, and therefore you find this. Could be. Or that immigrants come in and they bring with them not only labor supply, but also increased product demand, which shifts the labor demand curve. So what we can do is compute how large does this bias have to be to explain the differences, and just implausible. You need the bias to be orders of magnitude larger than the effects. In other words, that the immigrants coming in shifting labor demand more than labor supply. Okay, so that seems implausible. So we're going to kind of conclude that, to the best of our knowledge, this gap between the two literatures is real. Minimum wages do seem to have effect on wages, but not employment. And employment do seem to have effect on, or immigrations do seem to have effect on employment, but not wages. So, given that, we're going to turn to economics. So now, statistics doesn't help. We need to go back to the model. Think about whether the model is wrong. I mean, the model is obviously wrong. It's competitive market. It's not exactly like that. But in other words, is it wrong? So wrong that it gives you able to explain that gap. That's kind of the question then. And remember what we were starting with? We're starting with this idea that the literature suggests this. 2 points of the demand curve in the competitive model tells me what the demand is. A shift in supply because immigration tells me also demand, but they tell different stories. So now we're going to say, let's think about more realistic models. We're going to do two things. We're going to say, what are the extensions of that model that could help explain the effects? And how crazy parameter values or magnitudes do you need to explain it? So you're going to show in the theory, it's pretty easy to extend the model to explain it. Okay? In theory, it's possible. But you need pretty crazy values to do it. Okay? So we're going to start combining different things to get at that. So the story that I showed you here for immigration is saying labor demand is extremely elastic. You drop immigrants in the area, they're absorbed in the economy because it's not very costly to increase production. So if you're not economist, when people say labor demand is elastic or labor demand is responsive, it just means that if you want to expand your business from 5 to 10 people, it's not going to be a change in productivity. You're equally productive with 5 as 10 people. You might as well scale up. Okay? So that's what we need without in the competitive market. An alternative explanation we're going to allow for is that the substitution scale effects offset each other. What does that mean? Well, in the competitive model that I showed, all workers were the same. Okay, kind of a stupid model. So let's allow for heterogeneity across workers. Let's think about them differing in two ways: low skilled and high skilled, or low and high educated, or different levels of education, and conditional on that, the country of origin. Maybe like for a given level of schooling, immigrants are different from natives because they don't know the language or they have an accent or something like that, okay? So that would mean they're not perfect substitutes. It's not like I can take one native worker with college and replace him with immigrant worker with college without changing what you get back in terms of output. So that's possible. If you do that, then it's another way of getting this to work. Why? Because now two things are going to happen when I bring in more immigrants. It makes labor cheaper. I'm going to scale the production, do more. So that, but at the same time, I may substitute towards using more immigrants because they become more of them, and they're relatively cheaper. So that's the substitution effects. Those two may offset each other, in which case there's going to be no effect on the native wages, there's going to be big employment effects. Guys, that's the alternative way to get immigration to work. We think that immigrants and natives are not perfect substitutes, and substitution effects offset scale effects, and therefore you're going to get this. Okay, that's one possibility. The third possibility we entertain is immigrants bring in not only the supply of the labor, but also demand stuff. Okay, they want, some local goods, housing, they want like locally produced food and so on and so forth, which increases demand for goods, which again increases demand for labor. We're going to allow for that. It's going to turn out that this is pretty hard to get to be important, because you then need the immigrants to be much more increasing the local demand than they do the local supply. Otherwise, you don't really get that to be important. We're going to allow for it and quantify it. So that's how we get immigration to work, the story. You can go away from the perfect elastic demand, thinking about immigrants and workers being imperfect substitutes, with scalar substitution effects offsetting each other, and or introduce non-tradables. Okay? That's going to fix, in theory, the explained immigration results. Okay? So what about now the minimum wages? The key way to get the minimum wages to work is to introduce some wage setting power. I'm going to go through that in detail, because that's a bit more involved. So that's kind of the canonical explanation in labor economics for the minimum wage effects being small or even positive, is that firms have market power. Firms, when they hire, they want to not hire too many people so they can keep the wage low. Okay, or exploit the workers. If you then get the minimum wage, then it could be that they're forced to increase their employment instead of decreasing their employment. So that's kind of the idea. We're going to say that it's not that easy, actually, because minimum wages is going to have different effects across firms. One effect is going to be that those firms that are high paying, they're not going to be affected directly at all, because the minimum wage doesn't bind. It doesn't matter for like Goldman Sachs or the minimum wages. Okay? They don't pay minimum wages. They might be indirectly affected in the economy through equilibrium effects, so on and so forth, but they're not directly affected. So those are not going to give you this wage setting argument to work. Then you're going to have some firms that are going to be lower paying, and they're going to be affected directly by the minimum wage in the wage setting. Here's where this market power argument may come into play. There's also going to be these firms that are really low paying, and for them, it's not the market power that matters, but it's the labor demand again. I'm going to show you why. And empirical work on this kind of tend to ignore this and say that most firms are like this. That will make the story easy, but in reality, that's not going to be the case. So this might help explain the minimum wage effects, but it's not obvious. Let me go through that argument with a bit of detail. This is showing the wage against the employment level, the choice for a firm. This is how the productivity of the firm depends on how the productivity of the last worker you hire depends on how many people you hire. Okay, so that's like downward sloping usually we think, or flat. The last guy is I have a machine, I have some capital, so the last guy I hire, he may have less time with the machine or the capital, so he gets a little bit less productive than the first guy. So it's kind of like downward sloping. In a competitive market, you're going to have a supply meeting a demand, and that's going to determine the wage. Okay? If you have imperfect competition, you have some market power, then the firm realizes that if they set the wage a bit different from the other firms, not everyone is going to leave. Some are going to stay, and when they realize that, they're going to say, I'm going to screw these guys. I'm going to reduce employment so much that I can pay them less and get some more profit from that. So in economics, we call that the firm is faced with a firm-specific supply curve. This is telling me how the firm is trading off the fact that if they lower the wage, they get less employment, but also have to pay the workers less. So if they have this market power, they're going to choose to pay people this amount instead. They're going to be on this labor supply curve, as we say, not the labor demand curve, when you change the minimum wage from here to here. So that's what's going to help us potentially explain these findings, is that the firm responds not on the labor demand curve, but instead on the labor supply curve. Okay, so then you can break this result that the two shocks give us the same thing in the labor demand curve. So that's what I'm drawing here, a firm that's binding on the minimum wage. And then you have the least productive firms. They're actually going to be on the labor demand curve again. Why is that? Because if they were on the labor supply curve, they will lose money. Okay, they will be like losing money by paying that much. So they're going to like actually choose to respond in terms of the labor demand curve. So those are the three types of firms. The most productive, no direct effect on the minimum wage. The medium productive, there we're going to be not on the labor demand curve anymore, we're going to be on the labor supply curve because they have market power. And the least productive, they're going to be back on the labor demand curve again. So now, if God gave me how many firms were like that, how many firms were like that, and how many firms were like that would be good to go. I can compute how an immigration shock would affect the economy. And sorry, a minimum wage shock. So we can, God doesn't give me that, at least not yet, but we can allow him, we can derive what the minimum wage effect should have been. It's going to be a weighted average of the elasticity of labor demand, which is the competitive market, and the elasticity of labor supply, the market power. We can compute the weights from data, and now we can start figuring out whether it's plausible that market, or how much market power we need for this to explain these minimum wage effects. That's going to be sort of the exercise. So without having, so exactly how much that's going to be depends on what else you add to the model. So in our paper, we're going to add two things in. We're going to have non-tradables and local demand. That's going to help to get less market power than we otherwise would need, because now firms can pass part of the cost of an increase into the local prices, which we see in the data. So the employment falls by less. Okay, so meaning some of the adjustment happens through the prices, not only through the jobs. The second thing that's very important, that's going to be key for our insights, is all of this depends inherently on the elasticity of labor supply to the market. Well, this is the elasticity of the labor supply to the market. It's telling me how much do you need to pay to get workers to start working. Not that your firm start working at all, or coming from a different market and start working in your market. So going from non-employment to employment, or from employment in a different market and instead working in your market. Okay, why does that matter? Well, think about these three firms. These productive firms where there's no direct effect, those are going to be indirectly affected because they're competing over the same labor. Okay, or could be competing over the same labor. If the elasticity of labor supply is very inelastic, meaning it's very hard to get people to start working, it's very hard to get them to move in, then you have to be stealing labor from the other firms. So when the monopsony firms try to steal labor, hire more people, they're not getting people out of employment then, or from other markets, they're stealing from the firms that already are working. And that's going to dampen the employment effects. So there's a direct link between the labor supply to the market and how much market power you need. The more inelastic you think employment is to the market, the more you need to pay people to start working at all, then the less market power you need. Okay. So that's going to be key for ours. So this is like, the model without math and without being formal. We take this model and we go to the US data. Okay, we take those estimates of minimum wages and immigration, we use other data like the wage distribution we see, the employment distribution we see, the share of immigrants, the share of workers, and we say, let's now see what values of the parameters, in other words, how big does the market power have to be, how elastic does the demand have to be, in order to explain the data. Okay? Many in this room work on this, partial identification. We're not going to show exactly, it's not going to be one solution, it's going to be many solutions, but we can characterize them, and we can show you exactly what they are in order to explain the data. Okay? So that's like, a lot of the papers are going to be this, we're going to be one slide here, but that's kind of the goal. We have a model now, it's very rich. It's not a competitive market model. Let's put the data in the model to the test and figure out what combination of that model do you need in order to explain the data. A model is just an internally consistent explanation. So in other words, tell me what are the explanations of the labor market do we need to believe to explain this data. When we get that, we get these 4 cases. Okay, let me go slowly through those. I think I have time for that. And it turns out there's sort of 4 distinct cases that can help explain the data. Okay? One of them, this is about labor demand, the firms. This is about labor supply and market power. Okay? So let's start with like the first one here. The first one is saying, this is like labor demand is very elastic. I can absorb the immigrants directly without changing wages. Okay, done. I explain the immigration effects. When I go from here to here, I say, I don't believe labor demand is that elastic. But I think immigrants and natives are imperfect substitutes, and scale effects offset substitution effects. So that's the alternative explanation for labor demand. Then we go from here to here. Both of these are able to explain the immigration effects. When I go here, these are the 2 cases that can explain the minimum wage effects while still sort of being consistent with immigration effects. We will explain them jointly. This is the case with inelastic labor supply. A lot of people in the profession think that's the case. It's hard to get people to work. It's hard to get people to move around across markets. And that's why we can tax them a lot without distorting their behavior. If you're in that camp, you need a high monopsony. Why? Because now the firms that are increasing employment when you have a minimum wage, they're stealing the jobs of the guys in these other firms. So you need a lot of this in order to get the effects you want. If you're more of a guy, which I belong in this camp, I think people are estimating the elasticity of labor supply incorrectly, and people are actually much more elastic than they think, then you get away with much lower market power. So let's be concrete about what that is. These numbers may not mean like much to anyone here, but the markdown is interpretable. The markdown in this case is 40%. What would that mean? It would mean that the wages that firm pays are 40% lower than the productivity of the workers. Okay, that's pretty high. If you want to be in that camp and explain this data, you're gonna have to believe that. There has to be at least 40% marked on the wages. If you go down to this case, where you have elastic labor supply, you get away with 11%, which seems more like the literature, I think, or like more plausible. Firms have some market power, but they don't have that much market power. So that's sort of the change we're talking about. When I go across here, I go from having elasticity of labor demand that's close to infinite, they can absorb all this, to one that's smaller, but where immigrants and natives are imperfect substitutes. So now you might ask, or we asked, how can we rule out these cases? Just too many of them. I don't want 4 cases. I want to nail down more about the function of the labor market. Well, bring in more data. So the message of this talk and the paper is, you can't have it any way you want. Okay? If you want to explain stuff in the data, don't look at one thing, look at many things. See if it's internally consistent with that too. So you can go to the data on immigration. David Card has a very nice presidential address at the AAA, where he talks about how close substitutes are immigrants and natives, conditional skills. And he argues, and I agree, that the best evidence is they're very close substitutes. Take the skill level of an immigrant and a native, hold that fixed, put a native or an immigrant into production, and they're going to produce pretty much the same. If that's the case, this thing is gone. You can't be in those 2 cases. Okay? So let's rule those out, at least for now. Maybe you guys are going to say, oh, no, that's not true. But let's entertain that. then you're left with those two cases. Either you're going to be in a world where like monopsony is very, very high, meaning you think that firms are able to exploit workers so much that they mark down the wage, they pay them 40% compared to productivity. I mean, there's quarters of this profession that believe that. So let's just allow that to be possible. It's consistent with the data. But then you need to have very inelastic market supply. Okay? Or you can allow for more elastic market supply, not very elastic this either, but more elastic, and you get more reasonable numbers of monopsony, down to 11%. Okay, so why do we care about this? Well, that's like the last part of this paper, saying now we looked at the data, we figured out what people estimate when it comes to immigration effects and minimum wage effects. Not a single study, but overall, the whole literature. Then we've taken that to a model. The simple model is rejected. You're not in the competitive labor market, for sure. You must be far off. But then let's put stuff into that model that may help explain it. We put this into the model, and we quantify the parameters, the strength needed of these mechanisms to explain the data. And we end up with these 4 cases. I mean, there's more cases too, but these are kind of extreme or interesting cases. And then, now we have it. So why do we care about that? Well, what I would say to my students and maybe my fellow labor economists is saying, you got to choose. Which one are you in? Like, you can't say inelastic market supply and low monopsony. Just that can't be. Then you have to reject some of the data. You don't get to pick and choose, either in this camp or in this camp. Or you write a different model, come up with some other explanation. But if you stick within these extensions, you're gonna pick and choose. So suppose you pick this one. I mean, a lot of my fellow labor economists would say they believe labor supply is inelastic, so labor taxes doesn't create much distortion. Okay, that's common wisdom in public finance, I'm told. So suppose you believe that, but that's all you're looking at is this labor supply and taxation. That's true under perfect competition. If labor supply is inelastic, you could tax the guys a lot in a perfectly competitive labor market. Why? Because you don't distort their behavior. People don't respond anyway. So you get a lot of revenue back without changing much how much people work. Okay? So that's like public finance. But, you know, that's not going to be true if you think labor supply comes together with imperfect competition. Okay? Which we're going to argue it has to. So if you think that people are inelastic, but firms have a lot of market power, it means that the gap between the marginal product, how productive the workers are, and what they're paid is already big before the taxes. It's already a big wedge between how much you're left with when you go home, your take-home pay, and how productive you are. You're already distorting the labor choices a lot. And if you put taxes on top of that, it gets even worse. Because the deadweight loss, the efficiency loss of taxation, is squaring the total wedge. It's a combination of both two, and you square it. So that is huge, even if people are inelastic. So, you know, you kind of have to pick and choose. If in a world where you want to like argue this, that people are inelastic, that comes along with high monopsony, which means that, and it comes along with elastic demand, which means that good luck doing progressive labor taxes without problems, or even worse, try to tax the firm. If you try to tax the firm here, they're just going to pass it on to the workers, because their labor demand is elastic, supply is inelastic, the least elastic guy bears the cost of taxation, and they're going to pass it on. So our view on this is, this kind of disciplines the debate. I can be here, I'm in this camp. I mean, both are consistent with the data, so I just think that we have good evidence of labor supply being elastic. But if you want to say that, then it's not so clear you don't want to tax firms, because the workers may bear less of the cost, and the deadweight loss is smaller. But now you're going to accept that there's a pretty competitive labor market, and labor supply is elastic. So that's kind of a punchline. When you combine theory with data, which is what we try to advocate at Chicago and many other places here. It's good to use data, but data alone doesn't tell you much. It's good to use theory, but theory alone doesn't tell you anything. It's just speculation, internally consistent speculation. If you combine them, you get a lot, because you can sort out which theory or which speculations are consistent with the data. We try to do that in this setting using the evidence of minimum wages and immigration. And I think it produced one interesting insight so far, or a couple. You can't have all of these things. You can't argue that immigration has no effect on wages. Minimum wage has no effect on employment. And there's little efficiency loss from labor taxation. You get 2 of the 3, you can't get all 3. As Rolling Stone said, you can't always get what you want. But I would argue sometimes, the next line in that song is that sometimes you get what you need instead, which I think should be lower taxation on labor income if you believe the evidence. So that's kind of the agenda here, trying to bring together different pieces of evidence and in one coherent model to learn about public policy in an internally consistent way so that we don't get to pick and choose our views.
Q&A, questions? Well, I'm glad you ended with that Stones album. I think that's when Morley started his career, when that album came out. Is that right? Well, anyway, thank you so much. I mean, that was pretty impressive. I know for some of you who haven't been in a classroom for a while, there was a lot of graphs, a lot of equations, but the insights there are really deep. And there was a lot of synthesization to make this accessible. So pretty incredible. By the way, I saw some people taking screenshots of the screen. We actually make this public, like the presentation, with the speaker's consent. So when you go onto the website, you'll see the past presentations and this year's as well. So don't worry if you didn't capture everything. We have some time for questions, and we have a microphone that's going to, 2 microphones that will go around the room. Please, weigh in. There's a question right at the back.
Hi
and maybe introduce yourself and then ask the question, yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Ellie and I'm currently in the I'm IRHR student. As you know, our program focuses heavily on unionized environment and my interest is in labor relations. So I'm just curious, for your research, is there any data that you looked into specifically, private versus public sector and like unionized versus non-unionized environment, especially because you mentioned the monopoly power. So just another thing is, I know that you use mostly US data. How applicable do you say is this research for the Canadian context, and what would you suggest for the policy, especially the immigration policy that's still changing in Canada?
Okay. There were several questions there. So we're looking at the US in a period with pretty low unionization in the private sector. So I think that's probably not as important in this setting. I have other work looking at Scandinavia where I think you have to think about collective bargaining, coordination. If you want to think about like labor market power in those settings, it's like on both sides. You have firms that act collusive, they formalize it through employee federations, and you have workers that act through big collective bargaining things. So I think that some of these models will be pretty badly if you apply them. It's not the models I use in Norway, okay? If you want to do that. So you're going to have to tailor the model to the setting, otherwise it makes no sense. I think you have a good point about public sector. Harder to study public sector because it's hard to know what they maximize. We don't see the output. And a lot of the theory we have about labor demand is sort of derived from a firm maximizing something. When I look at my university, I have no idea what they're maximizing. Like we have a bunch of people who want to get in, and we admit 5%. It's like having why don't we raise the price? It's like that's what we're supposed to do if we're like profit maximizing. Maybe not profit maximizing, but what we're maximizing then. So I think these are like all interesting questions that I have no answer to. I don't think we have a good model of government firms. So that's we're kind of like not thinking about the labor demand of those. Maybe other people are going to solve that problem. But then you have to explain me what the hell they're maximizing, and I don't know what they're maximizing. And then I don't know the labor demand either. So that's sort of like on immigration policy. Look, I mean, the point of our paper is a little bit like, we don't know. The data so far are consistent with multiple competing explanations of the labor market. Okay? So if you go back to this, I mean, if you don't believe the card studies rule out this, then, you know, you have pretty distinct views on the labor market. One says, never mind like immigration, because labor demand is perfectly elastic. They come in, they absorb immediately without a loss in productivity. This is not saying that. This is saying that there are negative wage effects through substitution, but they're offset by the scale effects. That's going to have very different implications for thinking about optimal immigration policy. So I'm kind of surprised by how academics, given the evidence, can be very sure about this. I don't know. Like, look, I think it's pretty good evidence to rule out these things. I don't know whether labor supply is inelastic or elastic in the US. I think we're in this camp. Other people that are very smart, I respect a lot, think we're in this camp. I don't understand how they can then also think that we can have progressive taxes without big efficiency loss. Even if you're smart, you don't get to pick and choose among the evidence. So that's kind of our points. I don't want to talk about policy because like, there are many explanations. Pick your favorites, but be consistent. You don't get to pick and choose.
Great, thank you. Question there, back again. Just introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks. I'm David Price. I'm an assistant professor in the economics department. I was wondering, it seems like the results on elasticity of labor supply are based on results on minimum wage, sort of based on poor people. The progressive taxation would generally have lower taxes on poor people, but higher taxes on rich people. Would it be consistent to think that the elasticity of supply might be different for rich and poor people, and so you might get different effects on taxation from that margin?
Yeah, but this is like on the market labor supply. You sort of aggregate over all the people and see like how many people do you pull in if you start changing the wages. So I would think this is like, you know, mostly going to be people either from other areas working there, or going to be people not working, so extensive margin. The hours adjustments are like not that big to really matter in this kind of settings. So if you think about what it says, the people in this camp thinks that the earned income tax credit didn't do much to extensive margin labor supply. Okay, there's a group of people that believe that today, that really question the fact that you can pay people to work. They think negative income tax didn't do much. I don't think the evidence on their side, but like there are very smart people who strongly believe that labor supply taken as a whole to the markets is pretty inelastic, even on extensive margin. I mean, that's like an active debate, even within the department on the West Coast, names not to be mentioned, they strongly disagree about that. So I think that's interesting. But then I say, like, if you're in that camp, you can't be in this camp. And that matters because the efficiency loss depends not only on the elasticity of labor supply, but also on the total wedge between the wage and the productivity, including the markdown. But I'm happy to learn more about labor supply elasticities. We're actually doing a big experiment in Norway, randomizing earning income tax credits. So we're going to learn in Norway at least how people respond without, but you know, I think this is the best evidence. But anyway, this is why we don't have it in the paper. We keep this open because reasonable people disagree, I think.
Great. There's a question. There's two. One, we'll go back and forth on each side. We'll take that question first. Oh, yeah. Right there. Andreas? The one. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Lewin Goldring, Sociology. Lewin Goldring, Sociology, not here. I'm not an economist, so big caveat there. I'm just trying to understand how the possibility of non-permanent resident immigrants might affect this in the US context in particular, whether they're in the data, and how that, in a sense, introduces more variation in the elasticities that you were talking about, and others. I mean, I think it's a serious question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot on the studies. Some of these studies, remember we look over whole, like even 70 different papers. Some of those papers have some measure about immigration that's including those that don't have a visa. Other studies do not. So it really depends on the study. Remember, we don't have any new, we're not using any new data, we're just looking at what they did. And it's kind of remarkable how similar the estimates are among those that only look at sort of those with visa as opposed to those without. We don't sort of vary a little bit, but they also suggest that if you get more immigrants into a labor market, the natives are not going to lose their job that much. And their wages are not going to go down that much. There's some variation across things, and maybe this is a very salient dimension, and maybe we could do even better on that. But I don't think it stands out as being something that then we find something completely different. But, you know, on the top of my head, I don't remember exactly how many papers do that, how many people should look at everyone. But my reading of the literature after going through these papers is they're remarkably similar. There's a big fight within the literature where people disagree strongly about small differences. That's kind of my view on this. People are like, you know, mortal enemies over relatively small differences when you look across literatures. The real difference is the minimum wage versus the immigration, not within each of those. If that makes sense. I mean, I'm not really answering your questions because I don't know the details of all these studies, but I mean, it's a fair question, it's an important question.
Certainly in Canada, while we bring the mic over, we have a temporary foreign worker program which binds the employee to that firm. So there's not that kind of mobility. So it's not just someone who's not registered as a visa, who's kind of a person can work and be mobile. This is an actual attachment to a firm, and they can be sent back home if the conditions change.
There is a nice discussion about this issue, related issue in Card's presidential address, where he talks about, do the immigrants look like the natives in terms of the skills? And he sort of argues that if you look at, this is like 2009, if you look at the 90s and early 2000s, the immigrants coming in look a lot like the natives when it comes to the skill distribution, education distribution. There's a mix of like high skill and low skill, high school dropouts, high school graduates, and college graduates that are remarkably similar to the population education. So we should think about typically the immigration flows that come into the US over here in that period to being more like getting more people of the same type than getting a very different composition of education. So I don't think he has the immigrants without visa as part of that. So that might change quite a lot that calculation, which is pretty important. That's why he's thinking about what's going on is that you kind of just get more people of the same type. What happened to the firms then? That's kind of the thought experiment I think many economists do when you think about immigration in the US. While in Europe, you get much more low-skilled immigrants. They don't look as the population at large in Europe at all. So it's very different across countries, these things. But what you're saying is maybe the US looks more like Europe if we do the accounting for a certain part of the immigration. But maybe you're saying that, but that would be possible. Okay.
Thank you. Question?
Hi, I'm Anna, PhD student in industrial relations. My question is about the definition of employment in the papers that were used and whether that includes people who decide or choose to opt out of employment or people who work, for example, within enclaves in the case of the immigrants. And whether it's the case or not, how that would affect the model.
So a challenge doing these meta-studies is that no study is exactly the same. So a lot of the work in the paper is trying to make them comparable. Some papers are going to define employment looking at work, not work. Some are going to do the hours. Some is going to say include job search, but not this. So a lot of the stuff we do is try to go through the papers and make them as homogeneous as possible. That's going to be imperfect because we don't have all the data. And I think this will be one of the things we don't deal with. So all these meta studies come with like a lot of caveats that they don't measure things exactly the same. So we did like a lot of legwork trying to improve that. That's almost certainly flawed, but we're trying to sort of do as much as we can with that, and it didn't seem to matter that much.
Okay, time for one last question, if there's a burning one here for us. Yeah, we'll take that one. Introduce yourself, Frank.
Yes, hello. I'm Frank Reed. I've been cross-appointed in both the Economics Department and the Center for Industrial Relations and taught for many years. First of all, I thought that your survey of the empirical literatures was terrific. My question is, though, about just the basic textbook model that you started off with, the supply-demand models and so on. My understanding of the textbook model, and I've been using, Morley Gunderson's textbook for many years. He's co-author along with many other co-authors. But my question is just on the immigration side. My understanding of the textbook model is that, we have a downward sloping demand curve, an upward sloping supply curve for the economy as a whole. And then when you have immigration, it shifts the supply curve to the right, but from a macro perspective, it also shifts the demand curve to the right because, those immigrants are buying goods and services and so on, shifts the demand curve to the right. So the reason why there may be minimal impact on wages is not because the demand curve is horizontal, but because the demand curve is shifted to the right.
So that's what we kind of extended when we look at local market. So, the way I think about the economic model is that we have a small open economy. So demand is given abroad. That's the simplest model of the labor market. What you consume is not really local. It's consumed everywhere. In that case, it's just a shift in supply. And then the first extension we do in the paper, we say, but immigrants also consume local stuff, just like the natives. We know the share of stuff that's local. You can go to this, measure that. So we then allow the immigrants to shift product demand, and because they demand more stuff, they also shift labor demand. What we're finding is that is unlikely to explain these findings, because you would need the change in product demand be much larger than the shift in labor supply to rationalize the gap between those two curves. And that seems not consistent with the consumption pattern of immigrants compared to natives. So while it's true that it goes in the right direction, it helps to explain it. We would need some very strange data to explain that gap with a shift in local demand. We need almost no demand that comes from outside that region to get that effect.
Yeah, I think that prompted a question. Yeah, we'll take that question. It'll be our last. Yeah.
I'm holding you a little bit longer here.
No, that's good.
I'm Eduardo Souza Rodriguez, a professor at the Economics Department. My question is a little bit similar to the previous one. I was thinking about, this is terrific work. There's a lot going on here already. As usual, I guess my suggestion is to put even more, which you might not want to, and understand. I was thinking about unemployment, labor participation, or self-employment. Because you can either work or not, but if you don't work, if you're not hired, you might open your own business, or you might decide to draw away from labor market completely.
So that's going to be in our elastic supply to the market. This is supply to paid employment. So that can come out of non-employment. It can come out of people moving in from different areas, or it can come out of self-employment. So you can think about the right value of that should be reflecting all these margins into paid employment. Why? Because it's really paid employment we're looking at as an outcome. But it would be interesting to break that down because, that would be interesting. But, that's kind of if you want to think about what is the right elasticity here, it should reflect all these three margins. Again, that's probably why it's probably a little bit larger than the typical, non-employment to employment transitions that people think about. So it's even a better argument for being in this camp instead of being in the other camp.
All right. Well, maybe with that, we can actually thank once again our distinguished speaker for both the presentation and the questions. And I also want to say a thank you to the great team that put this together from the Department of Economics, Wizard College, and the Center for Industrial Relations, Human Resources. I think you saw some of them come up stage and help with the microphone. And also to the staff here at the Hart House If we can give them a round of applause for their amazing work. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Candace. Thank you, the wonderful team. We thought this would be fun if you ended up going back to the University of Chicago, Department of Economics, with your United Steelworkers hat. So we've got one here. It's our new chair. It's the chair, the USW Leo Gerard Chair in Collective Bargaining and Worker Representation. And if you were to wear that, take a picture, we'd be really happy. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you once again. That was So with that, we'll kind of finish the formal part of the evening, but people will stick around. You can chat in the back, and there are refreshments and still some banter to be had. Thank you so much again. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.